The seemingly unending carnage that we discussed last time, the carnage of World War I, placed an enormous burden on the societies and the economies of those European countries that were directly involved in the conflict. This strain was particularly felt by those countries with already weak economic structures before the war began. And perhaps the weakest of these, comparatively in Europe, was the Russian Empire. And it is therefore not surprising that the Russian Empire became the first major casualty of the war. The first major casualty of the war. By 1917, the Russian Empire had sustained the greatest losses of all the combatants. Of the 15 million men that the empire mobilized, more than half of them, just under 8 million, proved to be casualties. 1.6 million killed, 3.8 million wounded, 2.4 captured prisoners. And these staggering figures do not take into account the equal or even greater losses in the civilian population and in destroyed property, transportational facilities, livestock, and most especially in those western provinces of the empire that included Ukraine. And not surprisingly, the fragile Russian economic structure had virtually broken down. There were severe food shortages, most especially in the cities, so that by the outset of 1917, the situation had worsened considerably, and in the capital, Petrograd, by the way, this is St. Petersburg, which was the capital, but it was renamed early on in the war, Petrograd, because St. Petersburg sounded too German, so we made it more Slavic, Petrograd. And in particular, in St. Petersburg, Petrograd, the situation dire, because in an era of mounting anti-German hysteria, food riots, strikes, and other demonstrations were a common occurrence. Criticism of the government was unrelenting, especially from the leftist opposition political parties in Russia's parliament. To recall, it's called the Duma, had been established first in 1906. And the crisis came to a head on March 8th, 1917. Massive protests against food shortages take place in the capital, Petrograd. Troops were called out, as they had always been in the past, but this time they refused to fire on the crowds. And instead, they joined the workers, the protesters, establishing together with them, already on March 12th, a council, or a Soviet, a term that we are going to encounter now over and over again. It just simply means council. So in March already, on the 12th, we have this Soviet of Workers and Soldiers Deputies. Workers and Soldiers Deputies, as you can see on that chart that I handed out. And both groups are represented, both the workers, urban workers, and soldiers. And this Soviet in Petrograd, or the example of it, was now repeated in several towns and cities throughout the empire. So many now towns and cities have local Soviets comprised of workers and soldiers' deputies. And what did these Soviets want? Well, they demanded an immediate end to the war, breakup of the imperial army, and replacement of the monarchy with a governmental structure based on what? These elected Soviets or councils. And so the first revolution in Russia of 1917, known, by the way, as the February Revolution because it occurred in February according to the Julian calendar, which was still the official calendar of the Russian Empire, of that Orthodox world, about 2 weeks, quote unquote, behind the Western Gregorian calendar. So we always have these two dates. So it's happening in the Western calendar in March, but it's the February Revolution. Now, despite their precipitous formation and rapid proliferation throughout major towns and cities of the empire, the Soviets of Workers and Soldiers Councils, did not take the initial lead in this February Revolution. Instead, they deferred to several members of the parliament, the Duma, who, under the leadership of a Prince Georgii Lvov, has nothing to do with the city of Lviv, these Duma representatives, took it upon themselves to negotiate with the Tsar about the increasingly critical political and social situation. And together with Russia's high command, these Duma representatives convinced the Tsar Nicholas II that he should abdicate. After some discussion, the Tsar actually agreed. And on March 15th, 1917, without firing a shot, the Russian monarchy had de facto come to an end. In place of the defunct monarchy, the liberal-minded Duma representatives, they hoped that Russia would be transformed into a parliamentary democracy of the Western European variety. However, a final decision on the structure and what should be the new structure of the Russian Empire, the now former Russian Empire technically, would have to await the convocation of a constituent assembly. A constituent assembly, another one of these terms that we will be encountering. But until a constituent assembly could be elected, these Duma representatives, headed by this Prince Lvov, formed a self-appointed provisional government. Provisional government, as you can also see on your chart. Interesting that this provisional government was immediately recognized by the Allies. Russian Empire was one of the Allies. The provisional government, like all governments, made use of the existing bureaucracy, the Tsar's bureaucracy, to carry out its directives. And during what came now to be called a transitional period, the provisional government's primary goal was to prepare for elections to a constituent assembly, because only that assembly could decide on on Russia's future governmental structure. But nonetheless, it had to do something in the interim, and most immediately it declared Tsarist censorship and other restrictions on civil liberties lifted. It democratized local government, and it instituted a broad political amnesty. And so many of the political prisoners, opponents of the Tsarist regime that were in various parts of Siberia in prison for long periods of time, now were freed, and they came back. But the two main problems facing the country, which is how this all started, that is the war and the food shortages, remained. And besides that, the provisional government had great difficulty in imposing its authority throughout this vast Russian empire. I mean, you're sitting at the far western edge of the empire, and you got this gigantic landmass running from the Gulf of Finland, where Petrograd is, all the way out to the Pacific Ocean. You can make all kinds of proclamations, but even just to get the message out there takes a long period of time. One major stumbling block was the problem of dual power. Dual power, as you can see on the bottom of that chart that I handed out. In effect, the now former Russian Empire was being ruled by two authorities. Two authorities. The provisional government, sitting in Petrograd, and the Soviets of Workers' and Soldiers' Deputies spread throughout many towns and cities in the empire. And initially, the relationship between these two was marked by cautious tolerance, let us say. Some individuals even serving in both bodies, both in the provisional government and their local Soviet. But by the summer of 1917, this tenuous relationship between the Soviets and the provisional government was quickly being transformed into one of mutual suspicion and even open antagonism. And it was therefore not long before actual authority, certainly in most urban areas, including the capital, Petrograd, was in the hands of the local Soviets and of Workers' and Soldiers' Deputies. And these Soviets, more often than not, blocked the directives of the provisional government. Now, the most contentious issue between these two bodies of this dual power was the provisional government's decision to remain a loyal ally and to continue its war effort against Germany and Austria-Hungary on the Eastern Front. And this, from the very outset, as we've already seen, was opposed by the Soviets. In effect, the provisional government was never able to overcome the same problems that had toppled the monarchy in the first place, that is, the economy and the war. Nor did it succeed in ever creating a constituent assembly, which it had proclaimed as its primary goal. And as the year 1917 wore on, the masses of the population became ever more impatient, and their political mood ever more radical, with increasing demands by the peasants for land, the workers for food and control of the factories, soldiers for an end to the war. And then we have another factor, the non-ethnic Russians or national minorities who in various parts were calling for autonomy, self-rule, and even independence. By the way, it would seem to be most correct to refer to revolution in the plural. Very often one talks about the Russian Revolution. Well, there was no the Russian Revolution. There were revolutions at various times and in various places throughout the Russian Empire beginning in 1917. Why? Because not only were there these two Russian revolutions in general, the February-March one, and then, as we're going to see, another one in October-November, but there were also several revolutions that occurred on territories inhabited by members of the empire's many nationalities. And so in the wake of this first Russian Revolution, the Ukrainian revolutionary era began as well. The Ukrainian revolutionary era, or the revolutionary era in Ukraine, can be said to have lasted from March 1917, when the first revolutionary changes began in the Russian Empire as a whole, as we've just seen, until October 1920, when the international situation in Eastern Europe finally began to stabilize a bit. And by the way, when that happened, as we are going to see, not today, by that time, Ukrainians were living or came under the rule of four states: the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Romania. But that is a future story. These 3.5 years from March 1917 to October 1920 witnessed several attempts to establish Ukrainian statehood, both non-Ukrainian and, both non-Soviet, as well as Soviet in orientation. This complex series of developments during the Ukrainian revolutionary era took place in an extremely complicated environment, an environment marked by struggles between competing Ukrainian governments, leaders of peasant uprisings, foreign invasion, civil war. And in an attempt to explain the complex nature of Ukraine's revolutionary era, we're going to divide it into 3 chronological phases, as you can see on your chart. And today we are going to look at the first phase, and in particular the year 1917. This phase began on March 13th, when news of the events in the all-Russian capital Petrograd reached Kyiv. Local leaders reacted immediately and formed what might be called now 3 centers of power. And so if there was dual power in much of the former Russian Empire, in several of the peripheral areas, there was what we can call triune power. And specifically in Ukraine, those 3 power centers were: 1, the provisional government, supported by a council of civic organizations and the bureaucracy left over from the empire. The second power center was the Soviets of Soldiers and Workers' Deputies, not only in Kyiv, but in various cities throughout Ukrainian lands. And the third power center was a council of Ukrainians called the Central Rada. The Central Rada is simply the Ukrainian word for council. So it's in Russian, it's Soviet, in Ukrainian, it's Rada. As you can see, we have councils all over the place. The Central Rada came into being on March 17 and was made up of political activists, civic organizations, professional groups that favored the idea that Ukraine was and should be a distinct entity with some degree of self-government. Before the end of this month, March, the Central Rada elected in absentia as its president, Mykhailo Hrushveskyi. We have encountered that name before. He was the professor of Ukrainian history in the Austrian Empire in Lvov, also president of the Shevchenko Scientific Society. At the outbreak of the war, he was in Russia and he was detained there. So he's there. I should stress here that as in Petrograd, where the phenomenon of dual power prevailed, so too in Ukraine were the lines between the provisional government, the Kyiv Soviet, and the Central Rada never really clear-cut. You could have people, members of all of these three. But the point is that there were three bodies that claim to represent Ukrainian, that is in the territorial interests sense, Ukrainian interests. That is the provisional government, represented by the former government, imperial governmental bureaucracy, and the armed forces, supported in Kyiv by the Council of Civic Organizations, the Soviets of Workers and Soldiers Councils, spread throughout Ukraine's urban areas, representing for the most part the urban industrial proletariat, and then the Central Rada, supported by nationally conscious Ukrainian leaders and organizations. Triune power. In theory, the Central Rada was an organ of the provisional government, in theory. And also, the authority of the provisional government, in theory, was accepted by the Soviets. In practice, however, and especially as the year 1917 wore on, the Central Rada, the Soviets, and the provisional government drew farther apart, so that before long, all three of them were competing for the allegiance of the masses and for control of Ukrainian territories. Of course, the provisional government had its hands full with this gigantic empire, and for all intents and purposes, the Central Rada was left alone, and under Hrushevsky's urging, it strove to become the supreme representative organ for Ukrainian lands. And in that regard, the Central Rada was rapidly transformed from a kind of clearinghouse for all kinds of Ukrainian national organizations to a political body representing all inhabitants on Ukrainian territory, regardless of their nationality. Not surprisingly, during this rebirth of Ukrainian political life, several parties came into being. Ukrainian Social Democratic Party, Ukrainian Socialist Revolutionary Party, Ukrainian Socialist Federalist Party, among the larger. The general aims of these leading parties, and then therefore the Central Rada as a whole, was to implement far-reaching social reforms and to raise the prestige of Ukrainian culture and Ukrainian language. Now, among the first steps taken by the Central Rada in its efforts to carry out these goals and to represent Ukrainian interests as a whole was the convocation in April, just 1 month later, of an All-Ukrainian National Congress. It was made up of 900 delegates from all over the country and 600 other participants. At this April National Congress, the Central Rada was reorganized to be more representative of the country as a whole. Resolutions were passed calling for autonomy, self-rule for Ukraine within Russia, and including the separation of the heavily Ukrainian inhabited provinces. Those were those 9 provinces, the dark portion on this map, where ethnic Ukrainians were in the majority. That's why we call them the Ukrainian provinces of the old Russian Empire. And to transform this area into a specific or special administrative area, there the school system should be Ukrainianized, and also called for the creation of a Ukrainian army. In June, the Central Rada sends a delegation to inform the provisional government. The provisional government wasn't paying attention to any of this. As I said, they were preoccupied with trying to keep themselves in power. But the Central Rada informs, and they got only, however, an evasive reply that Petrograd, the provisional government, could not recognize the Ukraine's Central Rada. Why? Because that fell under the jurisdiction of a future all-Russian constituent assembly. Namely, the provisional government really can't do anything until they have a constituent assembly, because the provisional government is provisional. The Ukrainians weren't deterred, however, by this evasive reply, and the Central Rada simply continued its attempt to extend its influence throughout the country that it claimed, or the areas that it claimed. Central Rada then sends another delegation to Petrograd in order to urge the provisional government to approve the idea of Ukrainian autonomy within a federated Russian state. Once again, the provisional government replies that no decisions could be made until after the establishment of an all-Russian constituent assembly. Leaders in the Central Rada now were kind of really upset by this continual evasiveness, seeming lack of concern or interest on the part of the provisional government. And so, on June 23rd, the Central Rada issues its first universal. Universal is a term, it's like a decree for all intents and purposes, or proclamation. Same kind of term that was used during the Cossack Hetmanate, already beginning with Khmelnytsky in the 17th century and into the 18th century. And so what did this first universal of in June? It proclaimed Ukraine to be an autonomous land within a federated Russia, and it called on the population to pay a special tax to aid the national cause. No more waiting for something from the provisional government. We are now an autonomous land. And to direct the destinies of the country, the Central Rada created a governing council called the General Secretariat. The General Secretariat, kind of an executive body. Russian circles, whether in Kyiv itself and in Petrograd, were now stunned by this Central Rada's declaration of autonomy for Ukraine and the creation of an executive governing secretariat. Russian press started writing all kinds of articles that this Ukrainian action was a betrayal, as they said, quote-unquote, a stab in the back of the revolution. And in an attempt to avoid further tension, the provisional government finally acted. It sent a delegation to Kyiv in mid-July, in the middle of the summer, led by a man named Aleksander Kerenskii, who was becoming the more and more important figure within the provisional government. Aleksander Kerenskii. He worked out a compromise. And what was that compromise? The Central Rada would not push further its demands for autonomy until the convocation of an all-Russian Constituent Assembly. But in the interim, the recently formed General Secretariat of the Central Rada could rule the country, although according to instructions to be received from the provisional government. In actual fact, however, this agreement, compromise, had little practical effect on relations between Petrograd and Kyiv. Why? Because friction continued between the provisional government and the Central Rada with its executive general secretariat. And on the other hand, Petrograd's public recognition of the Central Rada and its general secretariat, in fact, did enhance their image in the eyes of many minority groups in Ukraine who had previously been invited but didn't accept, but now did join the Central Rada. And so by the end of July, the Central Rada had 822 members, and 30% of those places, 30% of the members were allotted to specific national minorities on Ukrainian territory, numerical minorities, that is, Russians, Jews, and Poles. But by early autumn, the provisional government had much more serious problems than those Ukrainians, or for that matter, any other of the peoples within the former Russian Empire. Why? Because the provisional government was barely able to survive at all. Now, the greatest challenge to the provisional government throughout these months of 1917 remained its inability to resolve the problem of war. The war is still going on. The Eastern Front is still there. Another threat to the provisional government came from left-wing Russian socialist parties. One of these was known as the Social Democratic Party. The Social Democratic Party. And by the way, this party was divided into two factions. The Mensheviks, who were actually in the majority, even though Menshevik means minority. And, everything has to be double think here. So we have two factions. We have Mensheviks and Bolsheviks. I guess I'll write them down. Mensheviks and Bolsheviks. Mensheviks means minority, the minority in the minority, but nonetheless they have the majority. Bolsheviks means the majority, though they had the minority. But in any case, both of these factions of the Social Democratic Party aimed at the complete overthrow of Tsarist society and the establishment of a socialist state, that is, a state in which the means of production and land would be in the hands of the working proletariat, whether that proletariat was the industrial proletariat or the agricultural or agrarian proletariat, and also a government in the hands of the proletariat's leaders, that is, the party, the one party. The leader of the Bolshevik branch of the Social Democratic Party was a man named Vladimir Ulianov. Most people don't know who Ulianov is, but his revolutionary name was Lenin. He had spent the war years in Switzerland, actually in a very comfortable life. Then in 1917, he's permitted to return from Switzerland through German territory to Russia. He arrives in April and immediately calls for the overthrow of the provisional government. He's soon joined by several of his former Menshevik rivals, including a very talented person from Ukraine of Jewish background named Lev Bronstein, better known as Leon Trotsky. Now, the basic Bolshevik tactic was to increase the party's ranks and to enter as many of its members into the Petrograd Soviet, as well as every other Soviet of workers and soldiers' councils throughout the empire. Take over the Soviets. It's through the Soviets that we're going to carry out revolution. By means of the Soviets, each of which had its own military self-defense unit, came to be known as the Red Guards, red being the symbol of revolution. It's through the Soviets, with their Red Guards, that the Bolsheviks hoped to gain control of the country. And their tactics were rather successful, making use of the attractive slogans, peace, land, and bread, and all power to the Soviets. The number of supporters of the Bolshevik party itself, or element itself, grew from 24,000 to 350,000 members just in a few months of 1917. They felt so successful that Lenin tried to carry out a coup in July, but the coup was defeated by the forces of the provisional government. Lenin has to go into exile again, but this time he just goes to nearby Finland, which is going through its own kind of national revolution. But then in October, Lenin secretly returns to Russian capital Petrograd. Again, he urges an insurrection. And with the support of the Red Guards from the now Bolshevik-dominated Soviet in Petrograd, on the night of November 6, 1917, following some skirmishes, the Bolsheviks overthrew the provisional government. The following day, November 7th, of course, by the way, in the old calendar, it's October, so in that world, it's the October Revolution, but it occurred in Western calendar in early November. November 7th, the Bolsheviks took over the reins of government. Kerenskii flees with the rest of the provisional government. And from that moment on, November 7th, the course of Russian and, for all that matter, European history was to change. The Bolsheviks legitimized their action. They called a second Congress of Soviets that happened to be meeting in Petrograd, and that confirmed the beginning of this new order. And what was that new order? It was to be headed by a government or a council of people's commissars, and the leading members of that council of people's commissars were Lenin, who was the chairman, Trotsky as commissar for foreign affairs, and then a third was a man named Yosef Djugashvili, nice Georgian name. He was the commissar of nationalities. Again, probably you haven't heard of Djugashvili. His revolutionary name was Stalin. And so there you have it, Lenin, Trotsky, and Stalin. This Bolshevik coup in Petrograd on the night of 6-7 November immediately influenced developments in Ukraine. The result was now an open power struggle between those three power centers or factions. That is, those loyal to the provisional government, those loyal to the Kyiv Soviet of workers and deputies, soldiers' deputies, and those loyal to the Ukrainian Central Rada. So now you have these three forces in open opposition. As for the Bolsheviks, in Kiev as elsewhere, their tactic was to gain control of the Soviets, all power to the Soviets. And because it was through the Soviets that they were going to legitimize their authority, just like they did in Petrograd, so now they're going to do it in Kiev and elsewhere throughout the whole former Russian Empire. But the immediate problem was that the local representatives of the provisional government was still around, not yet ready to act on its own. The Bolsheviks actually cooperated and even joined the Ukrainian Central Rada. And therefore, in a few days on November 12th, together they were able to take over power from the departing military and administration of the provisional government. But this cooperation between the Ukrainian Nationalist Central Rada and the Bolsheviks did not last long. Why? Because on November 8th, the Central Rada actually condemned the Bolshevik coup in Petrograd, and it prepared to resist any similar attempts in Ukraine. And it was at this moment of a kind of political vacuum, after November 7, that the Central Rada, 2 weeks later, on November 20th, issues another one of its universals, its proclamations. This was by then the third one. And that universal proclaimed the existence of a Ukrainian National Republic. So now we actually have an entity. It did not, however, and this is important, did not call for independence, but rather continued to support the concept of a kind of new federated Russia, of which Ukraine would be an autonomous, self-governing part. In terms of territory, this Ukrainian National Republic was to consist of those former 9 imperial provinces. Again, here they are, the dark color on this map. During the rest of November and December 1917, the Central Rada consolidated its authority, and also it received the support of the Soviets in Kyiv and several other cities. And by the way, let's not mix up here Soviets with the Bolsheviks yet. The Soviets are just these councils, right? Which the Bolsheviks tried to dominate, but it's not only the Bolsheviks. So here we have now the Soviets giving support to the Central Rada, except one. Only the Soviet in Kharkiv in the east refused to recognize the Central Rada, pledging itself instead directly to the Soviet government in Petrograd. So already now we have this dichotomy. We have Kiev on the one hand and Kharkiv in the east on the other. The tenuous cooperation between the Central Rada and the local Soviets, particularly the Bolsheviks, loyal to the Soviet Council of Commissars in Petrograd, was not going to last long. In mid-December, the Bolshevik-led government in Petrograd issued an ultimatum, stating that unless the Central Rada suspended its activity within 48 hours, quote, the Council of People's Commissars, that is Lenin, Trotsky, and Stalin, the Council of People's Commissars will consider the Central Rada in a state of open war against the Soviet government in Russia. Now we have a Soviet government, not only the Soviets as councils. An open state of war then with against the Soviet government in Russia and in Ukraine. And in conjunction with this ultimatum, the local Bolsheviks in Kyiv planned to convene an all-Ukrainian Congress of Soviets. And in fact, that all-Ukrainian Congress of Soviets does meet in early December, but the Bolsheviks, of course, show up. They're prepared to take this Soviet over like they take over all of the Soviets, which is their goal. However, they were clearly out-supported by members of the Rada, or outnumbered by supporters of the Rada. In fact, the Bolsheviks had only about 100 out of the 2,500 delegates. And the Congress rejects the ultimatum of the Soviet government in Petrograd. So what do the Bolsheviks do? If you can't take over the Soviet, you march out and create another one. And they march out and they go where? They go to Kharkiv. And in Kharkiv, the delegates formed the first all-Ukrainian Congress of Soviets, Soviets of workers, soldiers, and peasants, peasant deputies. The Central Executive Committee of this Congress, formed on December 25th, 1917, calls into being a so-called Republic of Councils. That is, the first Soviet government of Ukraine. And so, by the end of 1917, this almost year-long struggle for political power in Ukraine had come down to two competing forces. The Ukrainian National Republic, called into being by the Central Rada, which in turn had come to dominate the Kiev Soviet, and the other, the Republic of Councils in Ukraine, called into being by the All-Ukrainian Congress of Soviets of Workers, Peasants, and Soldiers. And that was based in Kharkiv, composed mainly of Bolshevik-led workers from eastern Ukraine. The Kharkiv-based Republic of Councils, loyal to the Bolshevik-led All-Russian Soviet Republic, and with its help begins a campaign to dislodge, not only politically, but now militarily, the Central Rada and its Ukrainian National Republic in Kyiv. Already on December 25th, the same day that the Republic of Councils is called into being, a Soviet-Russian army moves into northeastern Ukraine toward Kharkiv. Doesn't this sound familiar? With this Bolshevik-inspired invasion, the military struggle for control of Ukraine had begun. And so we finish the year 1917 during the first phase of our Ukrainian revolutionary era. Thank you.